see how far we get. The plan's the whole chapter, but, we'll see. Genesis chapter 26, we're coming out of the story of the birth of Jacob and Esau and how Esau sold his birthright. And now we're kind of doing an overview of Isaac's life. He's the patriarch. You have three patriarchs. You have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Isaac's kind of the one who gets the short end of the stick. You've got a whole bunch of chapters devoted to Abraham. You've got basically half of Genesis devoted to Jacob and his family. But Isaac gets one chapter. Genesis 26 is basically the biography of Isaac. It's the whole overview of his life, essentially, leading into Genesis 27. And as we get started, just to help us think about what we're going to see in this chapter, let me ask you a question. Do you like sequels? Movie sequels? TV sequels? Yeah? Depends on what... Yeah, right, exactly. We're living in the time of sequels and reboots, aren't we? Basically, if it was popular in the 90s, they're like, I know how we can make money. We'll just reboot it. We'll do like a sequel. We'll do a continuation story. Or you have a movie that's wildly successful, and they say, we need to have a sequel. Oftentimes that fails miserably. Here's the question for you. Is the sequel ever as good as the original? Can you think of an example of where a sequel was better than the original? Do what? What'd you say? Terminator 2? Okay. I haven't seen it, so I don't know. I've heard Godfather Part 2 is better than the original. Haven't seen them, so I don't know. I've got one example in mind that's pretty much widely accepted universally. Empire Strikes Back, right? Everybody says it's way better than the original. I agree. Teresa's like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Star Wars, Teresa. Okay. Teresa's not in on this, okay? But whenever you have a sequel, right? Let's say you like the original. You hear there's a sequel. What happens? You're filled with all sorts of anticipation and expectation. You're wondering, what's it going to be? Is it going to be better than the original? You have all these expectations for what it's going to be, and you're just hoping that it can be as good, if not better, than the original. As we come to Genesis 26, what we're going to have are a bunch of sequels. Sequels to the life stories of Abraham. Basically, all the things that he encountered, a lot of the things that he encountered, we're going to have sequels to those in this chapter. And what we're going to get to see is how Isaac is going to handle pretty much similar events that his father encountered in his own life. And the question is going to be, as we're filled with this expectation, is Isaac going to do better than Abraham? Is the sequel going to be better than the original? Is it going to be more fulfilling? Is he going to be more faithful? What is it going to do? What is he going to do? What is it going to be like? And as we are going to study this chapter, since it's a general, broad overview of the life of Isaac, what we're going to get to see, and it's really the main theme of the whole passage, is how God works in the lives of ordinary people. We've got an extraordinary God and a whole bunch of just plain, ordinary people. And we'll get to see how God works in the lives of ordinary people. So I want to start by reading the first 6 verses. It says, Now there was a famine in the land, besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Gerar to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. And the Lord appeared to him and said, Do not go down to Egypt. Dwell in the land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands. And I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands. And in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham listened or obeyed my voice, and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Now, there are at least 2 callbacks to previous events in the life of Abraham. We're beginning to see callbacks, not quite sequels yet. They're kind of sequels, but what are they? Do you see the 2 of them? There's at least 2. Okay, the promise of covenant renewal. That's exactly right. So you have the affirmation of the covenant promises. These are the same ones that God made to Abraham in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, Genesis 15, 5 through 6, Genesis 22, 15 through 18. It's the exact things that God said to Abraham, and he's now saying them to Isaac. And so you have God establishing his covenant with Isaac here. And this is basically Isaac's swearing in ceremony. That's how you can think of it. It's God finalizing, you are the new patriarch. You're the new head of the family. God made this covenant with Abraham. He's making it with Isaac. He'll also make it with Jacob after Isaac. And so it's a swearing in ceremony of the new covenant head. But there's another callback. Did you see that one? Right. That goes with the covenant renewal. So yes, absolutely. The descendants as many of the stars. So part of the covenant promises. Okay, we can count that, but he's going to come up later, so we'll give you a half point for that one, okay? So yes, but more so later. There's a situation that Isaac is having to deal with that Abraham also had to deal with. Famine. That's exactly right. If you remember the very beginning of when God called Abraham to be his servant, the first two events in his life, there was God saying, you're going to leave your homeland and you're going to go where I show you to go, and here's what I'm going to do. And he does all the covenant promises. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. In you and your offspring, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So you have that, but then a famine hits. And where does Abraham go when the famine hits? Egypt. Where does Isaac want to go? Why Egypt? They've got the Nile. Exactly right. If there's a famine, the waters are always running in Egypt. There's always going to be food there. There's always going to be water there. And so you want to go where things are good, right? And that's exactly what Isaac is tempted to do here. But how does the story differ from what we saw with Abraham? He doesn't go, right? Abraham, God allowed him to go to Egypt. And we know a whole bunch of bad stuff happened there, right? But Isaac, God calls Isaac to stay where he is. Now, that might not seem like a big deal to us, but imagine you're living in an arid place like Palestine, right? Imagine you're there, and you have this new wife, and I don't think the kids had yet been born at this point. I think it's just kind of a recap of where they're at. So you've got this new wife. You're the new head of the people of God. You're responsible for feeding everyone. You don't even think you can feed yourself and your wife. And you know there's a place you can go where it would be super easy to get food. Life would be so much better in Egypt. And God says, I am calling you to stay here. Imagine how hard that would have been to hear. I want us to see that God often calls us to remain in the hard places. This is part of how God works in the lives of ordinary people. It's not something we like to hear, but God often calls us to stay in the hard places, like the job that you hate, that you want to leave, that you can't stand. And you're wondering, why am I still working this job if I could go somewhere better? They're paying more over there. The people are friendlier. Life would be so much easier. And yet you know that God's got this hold on you. And He's saying, I need you to stay here in this hard place. Could be the job you hate, the difficult marriage, the school that is so stressful you just want to leave every single day. And God is saying, I need you to stay there. Let's think about it in terms of spiritual life, though. It often applies to a church. Because think about how people think about churches these days. It's all cosmetic, right? Who has the most money? Who currently has the most people? Who has the best sound equipment? Who has the best music? Who has the preaching that's under 25 minutes? All right, Tommy Burdine, we're going to talk later. They want to go to who has the biggest children's program? Who's got the most charismatic personality on stage? They're looking at all the cosmetics and they're saying, I know God loves me. I know He wants me to be in a church, and it would be so much easier over there. Egypt looks real good. But isn't it very often that God calls us to stay in the hard places, even when it's difficult? Like I remember this church, 2020, when I was just stepping in because Doug Angel said, we have no one to preach. I need you to come preach. Sure, Doug. We had 12 people. I can't tell you how many phone calls I got, how many text messages I got from people saying, that church is doomed. That church is going to fail. I had a guy say that church will shut its doors permanently within 6 months, if not sooner. Could be 3. That church has no chance. And then I kept preaching here, and then y'all called me to be the interim, and I had people saying, do not take that church. You cannot take that church. If I were you, I would not take that church. I had a professor from North Greenville, will not say his name since we're streaming. Professor from North Greenville emailed me and say, I would not take that church if I were you. Let's be honest with each other. That's not an ideal situation you're walking into, right? You're coming out of a church split. You've got 12 people. You're looking around and all the help is gone and you're just, bare bones. And you're thinking, Egypt is looking real good at that point, right? The waters are flowing over there. I'd like to go. And yet I knew without a shadow of a doubt this is where God had called me to be. And so as much as impressed it upon my heart, for sure, absolutely. And I said, it doesn't matter how good Egypt looks. It doesn't matter how much food and water they have. God has called me here. And He doesn't just do that for the pastor. You understand that, right? Right, church? It's easy to go to the churches where everything's already set up. I use this example. We're definitely not getting through this whole chapter. I might as well just preach. Y'all let me preach. That's what you called me to do, so I'm just going to do it. But I use this example a lot. If you're a new couple, right, and you're wanting to buy your first house, it's so tempting to look at the houses that are turnkey, right? No repairs are needed. All the furniture is already there. It's got the car, 2-car garage that we want. It's got all the rooms we want. It's like the last house we'd ever want to live in. And you're a brand new couple, just got married, and you're thinking, it might bankrupt us and stuff. But it's the house that we want. We want to go to Egypt where the waters are flowing. And yet, sometimes you have to get the fixer-upper, right? Sometimes you're supposed to be in the house that's going to require work. And as church members, God doesn't always send people, and I'm not saying if you go to one of these churches, you're doing something God doesn't want you to do. God calls people to churches. And as tempting as it is for us in our worldly desires to want to go to the biggest church with the most people, with the most money, where it would just be super easy to get lost in the crowd and not have to do anything, God has called you to be His servant and to serve His church. And that means that sometimes you're going to have to stay in Gerar. That means sometimes you don't get to go to Egypt. Maybe one day the waters will be flowing, but right now, God calls us to the hard places because He has a plan for us here. I could stay on this point forever, but I'm going to move on. Yes, sir. I don't have my Hebrew Bible on me, but when I was reading it earlier, I believe that it was Yerah, but you're not going to like this. It means appeared. So, that's not to be, I'm not trying to be, but how that happened, right, how that happened is another story entirely. I believe that he audibly heard the words of God. What he saw, I have not any idea. It worked, right, yeah. It worked entirely. And so, because look at verse 6. That's what amazes me. So if you read verse 6, it says, so Isaac settled in Gerar. Isn't that amazing? You think back to this is better than the sequel, isn't it? Like, Abraham said, hey, there's a famine in the land. I know God said He'd give me this land and everything. That's sweet, maybe one day. But the waters are flowing in Egypt. I'm going there. But Isaac heard what God said, where God said, I will be with you. I will bless you. Do this for me. Stay here. Don't go to Egypt. And Isaac settled right there in Gerar. God called him to the hard places and he stayed there. Now, we're bragging on Isaac and saying, all right, you're doing great. Isaac is way better than Abraham at this point. But we continue. Look at verse 7. Verses 7 through 11. When the men of the place asked him about his wife, he said, she's my sister. Good grief, what is it with this family? She is my sister. For he feared to say, my wife, thinking lest the men of the place should kill me because of Rebekah, because she was attractive in appearance. When he had been there a long time, Abimelech, a king of the Philistines, looked out of a window and saw Isaac laughing with her. We'll talk about that in a second. Laughing with Rebekah, his wife. So Abimelech called Isaac and said, "Behold, she is your wife. How then could you say, she's my sister?" Isaac said to him, "Because I thought, lest I die because of her." Abimelech said, "What is this you have done to us? One of the people might easily have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us." So Abimelech warned all the people, saying, "Whoever touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death." Now here's the easiest question I'm going to ask you all night. What is this a sequel to? This is the easiest one. What is this a sequel to? Abraham. How many times did Abraham do this? You remember? Twice. He pulled this stunt twice. Now, I don't know if Abraham recounted this to Isaac. It's not a good look for him, but maybe he did and was like, "Hey, learn from my lessons." But Isaac stored it away for later, like, "Oh, if I ever need this, here's a nice little trick." And so he's doing the exact same thing as his father did. And so here's my question, how did Abimelech know they were husband and wife? Okay, what translation are you using? NIV, very interesting. Anybody else have something else? Showing endearment, okay. That is what the KJV says, sporting. So I don't know the last time you went sporting with your spouse, or if you know what that means. We'll put it in modern language. So here's the interesting thing. There's a huge play on words going on here in the Hebrew, and I circled the red part so that you can see, like even if you can't read Hebrew, you clearly can see these are the same. But this is Isaac's name, Yitzhak. That's Isaac, and this is what they were doing. Masakak. It's basically laughter, Isaac's name, laughing. But when used in this form and in this context, it means sporting. If you know what the word means. Or caressing is the NIV. Basically, when used in this way and in this context, this word refers to something that brothers and sisters should not be doing together. And so Abimelech is looking out of a window and he sees what's going on and he says, "Hold on a second. You're not brother and sister. That is your wife." Isn't it interesting that Isaac, we just bragged on him. Because why? Why? He trusted God enough not to let him die by starvation, right? But he didn't trust God enough to not let him die by the people around him. God will keep me safe and I won't die of starvation. But someone else might kill me. So I've got to take matters into my own hands, just like his father Abraham did. And so he sinned against God. And why did he do this? What was the whole reason? He gave his reason. What did he say? Verse 9. All right, let's emphasize the pronoun there. What's the first one? Lest I. Underline. 3 times. Emphasize. Bold. Lest I die. Who cares about Rebekah? Who cares who's going to take her? Right? He said someone might think she's pretty and sleep with her. So we need to say that, she's all this kind of stuff. He doesn't care about her. He cares most about himself. He's putting himself first in all things. That's his whole decision. And what amazes me even more is that, number one, it's the pagan, not even the person who's part of the people of God. It's the pagan who calls the believer out on sin. Now that, church, is an absolute and utter embarrassment. When the world sees what Christians are doing, and they're the ones who are offended by the sin, upset by the sin, know that it's sin, and calls Christians out on their sin. I mean, that's harsh, is it not? That's an indictment on us. And you can be sure, just as Abimelech was looking out a window and saw them, the world always has a window. They're always looking through it to see what Christians are doing. It's not just that they're merely observing, they're hoping for something. If they catch a glimpse of something, okay. You have to understand that our world is actively waiting to catch us in something. They are actively waiting for Christians to mess up, for Christians to say something that they can pounce on. That's why anytime a preacher says something, like the things I say, you have an article written about how preachers hate the government, or this or that, or we're starting an insurrection, or something other. Like, they are always looking through a window, waiting on us to fall. But what hurts me even more is that the believers here, in this case, it'd be Isaac, it hurts my heart even more when the believers are more okay with sin than the unbelieving world is. I mean, what does that say about us? That we are just nurturing and fostering sin while the world goes, that's not right. Here's the other thing. And I think I said this when we were talking about Abraham. Isaac was protecting himself. All right, so I'll just go ahead and put this up here. All sin is self-serving, and we'll talk about that more in just a second. But all sin is self-serving. That's what it is. But here's what gets me. Isaac was being self-serving. Isaac was protecting himself, thinking only about himself, not at all about his wife. As a husband, who is his primary concern? His wife. He's to protect her, just as God told Adam back in the garden. He is to watch over his wife. He's to be the protector. He's to guard the garden. The man is supposed to protect his wife, but notice that it is the pagan unbeliever who's not married to her who ends up protecting her. He says to everyone in the kingdom, if you touch him or her, you're going to be put to death. Now, you think about how that relates to us. I would say it like this. It is a crying shame when the unbelieving world is doing the things that we should be doing as Christians. When the unbelieving world are the ones doing everything we should be doing as Christians. When they're the ones who are protecting the unborn and caring about the unborn more than Christians. We praise God that there are some people who do that even though they aren't believers. But how much of a crying shame is it that they're more involved with that than the church is? How much does it hurt to see that there are nonprofit organizations that have nothing to do with Christianity that are helping the homeless, feeding the poor, taking care of the orphans, more than the church? That's our responsibility. We're called to go and serve the world for the glory of God, to care for those who cannot care for themselves. How much of an absolute disappointment is it when the unbelieving world are doing the things that the church should be doing? That's what we see here. That's exactly what Isaac is doing here, what Abimelech is doing. Isaac is failing to do it, so Abimelech steps in, and it's an embarrassment. And it's because all sin is self-serving. It blinds us to everybody else around us. Is that not right? When we sin, we don't care about the effects that it will have on other people, do we? We sin, as I've said before, you'll get this by the time I die, you'll be able to quote it and say, oh, that was one of his sayings. We sin because we want to. And because we want to means we don't care what it means for everybody else. If they are end up hurt by it, if they end up affected by it, if it disrupts their life or their job or their marriage, I don't care. I'm thinking only of myself in this situation. That's what we see here. Okay, we're only going to be able to get to one more thing this evening because y'all got me preaching. So, I do have another side. We're only going to get a little bit to it. But I want to start looking at verses 12 through 22. We'll read through this really quickly. It says that, and Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. The Lord blessed him, and the man became rich and gained more and more until he became very wealthy. Let's just pause there. That is not what you expect to read after what we just read. After Isaac failed to trust God, after Isaac sinned against God, after Isaac was thinking only about himself and didn't care enough for his wife to try to protect her, and it was left to an unbeliever, it then says that God blessed him. He was getting 100-fold, and he became more and more wealthy until he was the richest person in all the land. That's grace, folks. He did not deserve it, but God gave it anyways. We continue. He had possession of flocks and herds and many servants, so that the Philistines envied him. Now the Philistines had stopped and filled with earth all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father. And Abimelech said to Isaac, "Go away from us, for you are much mightier than we." So Isaac departed from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. And Isaac dug again the wells of water that had been dug in the days of Abraham his father, which the Philistines had stopped up after the death of Abraham. And he gave them the names that his father had given them. But when Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found there a well of spring water, the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, "The water is ours." So he called the name of the well Esek, because they contended with him. Then they dug another well, and they quarreled over that. So he named its name Sitnah. And he moved from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he called its name Rehoboth, saying, "For now the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land." A few things here. Number one, this Abimelech is not the same Abimelech that Abraham dealt with. That was about 80 years prior to this event, so that Abimelech is long gone and dead, but it's more of a dynasty name. It would be passed on to the next generation and whoever would become king of the land. So this is a different Abimelech, and we see a sequel here. Do you know the sequel I'm talking about from the life of Abraham? You have to be a real keen observer to get it. Think about what's happening here. Isaac is becoming wealthy. He's getting lots of possessions, and he's acquiring land, and there's a dispute. Does that sound familiar from the life of Abraham? Yeah, exactly. It's a sequel to the dispute with Lot. When you remember, they had acquired so many possessions and were becoming so wealthy that the land was not big enough for them, right? And so Abraham, as much as he would have liked to stay with Lot and enjoy each other's company and enjoy the possessions and the wealth and everything they had to part ways and move on from there. And the whole reason is because Abraham wasn't where God wanted him to be at the time. God was wanting him to move from that land to the promised land, the land that he was going to show Abraham. And so God used adversity in order to get Abraham where he needed him to be. Just as you remember, God does this all the time. Do you remember the story of Jonah? God said, "I need you in Nineveh." Jonah said, "I don't think so." And God said, "Okay, have it your way." And so God sent a storm, nearly broke the ship apart. He sent winds. He sent another storm. Then he sent a whale, or a big fish in the Hebrew. He was willing to use adversity and opposition and difficult times to get Jonah where he needed him to be. And in the same way, that's what we're seeing here. And it's a lot to take in when you're reading this, but his point that he's making is that Isaac was not where God wanted him to be. And so even though he acquired all these possessions, even though he acquired all this wealth, even though he would like to enjoy that wealth and live as a king in that land and be richer than everybody else and mightier than everybody else, God wanted him in another place. And so God used all this opposition and adversity to get him where he wanted him to be. And that's the point that he's making. God will use whatever means necessary to get us where he wants us. God will use whatever means necessary to get us where he wants us. You can think about this in Isaac's life. I mean, you can think about this in your own life. How many times have you been in a place and you have been facing constant pressure and adversity and opposition, and as soon as you started praying about that situation and you realized that God was moving you away from there and you decided to act upon that, relief, blessings, right? When we think about this in our own spiritual life, I want us to understand that God does this to us spiritually all the time. If you are in one place spiritually and God wants you in another place, do not think that he is above turning your life absolutely upside down to get you there. You know that, right? If you're the type of person who is thinking that you're saved by your works and you're trusting in your works and all of your good things that you do, and you're just thinking so much about yourself because of it, God will absolutely wreck your life in order to teach you about grace and how we are only saved by his grace alone. If you're the type of person who is self-sufficient, and you think, I know everything about my life. I don't need a God. I know who I'm going to marry. I know what job I'm going to work. I know how long I'm going to work, when I'm going to retire. I know where I'm going to live. I know how many kids I'm going to have. I've got an entire plan for my life. I'm totally self-sufficient. I don't need a God. Let me tell you what God's going to do. He is going to throw everything at you until you learn to be dependent on Him. I mean, I've told many people my testimony before. I'll just give you a very shortened version, but that's what happened to me. I was living a totally self-sufficient life, thinking I didn't need a God. I had absolutely everything planned out. If you had told me in high school that one day I would be the pastor of a Southern Baptist church, I probably would have been put in the hospital laughing. I mean, I probably could not have breathed. I would have been laughing so hard. We grew up Methodist. So there's no way. I had an entire plan. I was living a totally self-sufficient life, and then God took everything from me, and praise God for it. Didn't think that at the time. But God got me to a point where I realized that God was all I needed. But at the time, God was also all I had. That's how far I had to go. So don't be arrogant like me, in other words. Don't be as prideful as me. But I did not realize that God was all I needed until God was all I had. He used constant adversity and opposition and hard times to get me to the place He wanted me to be spiritually. He does this with our own pride. If you're prideful, the Bible says God will come and humble you. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled. If you're thinking in terms of self-righteousness, and you're thinking, I've done everything right. I've gone to church. I've read my Bible. I can quote the Bible. I own a bunch of Bibles. I sing in the choir. I serve in the church. I do all these things. And you're thinking to yourself, you know what? I bet God is. He's really pleased with me. He's happy with me. I bet I've impressed God. You know, He's had a lot of servants in the past. But I bet I'm up there. God will use whatever means necessary to teach you the truth of the gospel again, if that is you. That He does not need you. He doesn't need anyone. The Bible says God is the only one who is entirely self-sufficient and has no need of anything. He is not served by human hands. That you have not impressed God because you can't win His favor. You can't earn a right standing with Him, and every bit of your own righteous deeds are like filthy rags before Him. And so if you are filled with this self-righteousness and think that you've impressed God, He will absolutely humble you and throw life at you to teach you the truth of the gospel. And that's the most gracious thing He can do, is it not? At the time, you won't feel that way, because trust me, I've been there. I've been in the depths. I know what it's like. And you feel like this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me. My whole life is over. This is just miserable. And then you look back on it and go, if God had not done that, I would still be walking in self-righteousness, in pride, arrogance. I would be on my way to hell. But because God came and wrecked my life, I know that I'm going to be with Him one day. Now, I was going to tie all this into Jesus as we continued, but we're going to have to pick up with that next week. But I want us to remember and take some time to reflect on where you are as opposed to where God might want you to be. And understand that there are basically two ways. There's the easy way and there's the hard way. The easy way is to walk in step with the Spirit and repent of those sins and fall in line with God. The difficult way is God says, I want you there. I'm going to get you there. Don't make me send a well. He's not above doing it. Mr. McKinney, give us a final word of wisdom.